So first of all, a couple of a really quick introduction about myself. My name is Luca Belli, as you might have seen. I am professor of Internet Governance and Regulation at FGV Law School. So I'm a lawyer by training, but as anyone who deals with technology and internet matters, well, I have to deal also with non-legal things. And especially the theme that I want to explore with you today is about sustainable connectivity. And so how this theme, which may be seen as an essentially economic theme, intertwined with essentially legal issues, and also as a very strong strategic and political dimension. Next slides, please. So the three main areas I want to focus with you today are first some preliminary remarks on how do we consider internet users, and this is essential to then understand the rest of the presentation, and I think also for you to understand how really to deal with internet matters. Then we will spend a couple of words on net neutrality and some specific access model that are called zero rating. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but then I will highlight basically why these models allow us to understand that net neutrality is not really about content or competition, but it's really about data protection. And I will explain this into the presentation, and then at the end, towards the end, let's say a good chunk of this third section will be dedicated to alternative strategies to expand connectivity, and we will focus on community networks. Next slide. The majority of information that I will discuss in the first two parts, you may find them in this article that is a little bit old now. It's 4 years old, but really provides us a lot of information that are useful to understand how the internet has evolved, especially in developing countries over the past years. It is not in open access, but if you click on this mini URL I put at the top of the slide, you will be directed to an open access version, or if you simply Google the title of the article, you will find the open access version. Next slide, please. The rest, everything I'm mentioning about community networks is in open access. These 3 books are all in open access and all available. Only visiting this website, comconnectivity.org, you will find anything you may want to read about community networks. Next slide. If you are particularly interested in community networks at the Latin American level, so what are the main problems at the Latin American level with regard to connectivity, and how community networks may help solve those problems, I suggest you also check this open access, of course, report that I co-authored for ISOC. Now, next slide, please. We can start with some preliminary considerations. Next slide. So the internet, as I'm sure you have already discussed, is very different from previous networks, such as broadcasting network or radio network, because the internet is a general purpose network. What does it mean? It means that it has been conceived to allow the user to choose for what purpose he or she will utilize the internet, and even to actively contribute to the evolution of the internet. So it is not the purpose of the network is not predefined by the network operator. It is not only voice calls, as could be the telephone network, the old telephone network. It is not only TV programs, as it may be the broadcasting network. It is basically whatever thing you might want to access or share online. So it is the reason why it is the user is at the center of the internet. It's supposedly at the center of the internet, and this is why the internet can be qualified as a general purpose network. Next slide. Now, if we start from this assumption, then it's quite immediate to understand why the internet users are not mere consumers, passive recipients of TV shows or simple users of phone calls, but they are prosumers, meaning they can at the same time use and access something as a consumer, but they are also potential producer of new services, new applications. This word prosumer has first been coined by Alvin Toffler in the 80s in his book The Third Wave. Alvin Toffler, a futurist that you might know, he was a quite interesting person, and he coined these terms referring to in the agricultural sector. So it's not really digital. Well, it may be considered digital, but that is another story for another presentation. But so he created this term, which is extremely useful to qualify the internet users, because at the same time they can be consumers of services, of content, of applications, but they can also be producers of any content and application they may wish to produce, of course, if they have the possibility to do so. Next slide, please. Now, next slide, please.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. So, what is the consequence of this peculiar nature of the internet as a general purpose network, and of the fact that the users are prosumers? And it basically making concrete the promise of the right to freedom of expression, to be free to seek, impart, and receive information and ideas without borders, because users can freely, well, not freely in the sense of without restrictions. Of course, there is a cost connected to it, and that is a very important part of the presentation today. But users can easily, let's say, reach any part or any other user connected and exchange information, content. This is how the internet has been created, right? Next slide. Now, the corollary of this is that the internet allows permissionless innovation. I'm sure I've seen you have had classes with Windsurf. I'm sure he mentioned this concept. Means that basically, thanks to the internet, you can create whatever you want. You don't have to ask for permission to create something, and then you can share it. Then you can. The internet has basically unleashed communication between users. Any connected user can freely communicate, and the consequence of all this is also that the internet itself, that puts at the center the individual, then it is shaped by the creativity on the individual. So in this sense, the internet is a generative network because it is shaped by the contributions of the users, right? And here we come, next slide, to the net neutrality debate, because every element I have mentioned so far is really at the core of the debate that I'm going to briefly explore in the next, let's say, 10 minutes, so that you really then understand why these then connect with the overall internet openness debate, with connectivity, and then importantly with how connectivity can be expanded and how that is the most important part. Next slide. So
before I go to that, Luca, there's a question on prosumers. If you see in the chat, Jana asked how this prosumers definition puts the legal liability to any internet user when offenses happened, such as hate speech, fake news, manipulation, or privacy breach.
Now, the fact that is a very important question. The fact that you are free to share, to access or share any kind of content does not mean that magically everything it becomes legal. It means that the law that applies offline still applies online, and the various legislation that every country has did not disappear because of the arrival of the internet. That is a very old, actually, debate that in the US started in the late 90s, then moved all to Europe and the rest of the world in the early 2000s. And thinking that the internet is, I'm not, of course, arguing that any internet users can do whatever he or she wants, regardless of the legality of what he or she wants. Of course, there are always laws that limit what kind of content you may share, but let's say that within the legality you can do whatever you want. And the internet is the first network. The radical change that the internet offers is precisely that. Within what is legal, you can use the internet for whatever purpose you want. That does not mean that you can also do illegal things, exactly as in the offline world. And this is also a very, very old debate that already at the end of the 90s found some quite concrete replies, meaning that if you there was this very nowadays is a little bit vintage Declaration of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, arguing that the internet was some sort of detached world from the real world. Of course, this has been proven wrong since almost more than 20 years, because laws apply online exactly as they apply offline. Having said that, anything that is considered legal it's something that any connected individual can do, both as a consumer, as a recipient of information, and as a producer of information and services. Does it reply to your question? I hope.
Yeah, so Alfredo follows up on that, and this will be the last one for this section. We're sorry to hold you back, but he asked again, follow up on the prosumers definition. How do cross-border policies help to control or regulate the false news, the fake news, and all types of misinformation?
Now, that would be an entire new class on fake news and content regulation. But just for the sake of precision, this is something that first has to be considered on a layered perspective. Now, the issue at stake in today's presentation is infrastructure and how this can be expanded, and the role of individuals connected to infrastructure. If you then want to get into how to regulate content of specific services, that is another story. I think we should make this distinction. Every kind of service you use regulate content. If you take your favorite social network, you will know that there are terms and conditions that regulate what you can share and what you cannot, and the way they are implemented is maybe sometimes not really clear, but any service you utilize has a regulation of the kind of content you can share. But now we are not yet at that layer, if you want. We are not analyzing the applications layer where all your favorite social networks or blogs or website are. We are at another layer. I'm sure you have already made this distinction. I didn't made it explicit in the first part of the presentation because I thought this was something you might have already explored several times, and I wanted to avoid repetitions. But of course, if we take the internet, there traditionally is divided in several layers. Today's presentation concentrate on the internet access layer and how then the evolution of this impacts the rest, and particularly how we consider the internet user. Am I sufficiently clear, or is there any other follow-up?
I think we're good. So please,
okay.
move to the next one.
Okay, wonderful. Now, so what we are coming back to the internet access and this infrastructure layer. Here is where the net neutrality debate was actually born. Why? Because I'm sure you have already heard that the intelligence of the network is at the edges and the infrastructure is just dumb pipes, meaning that the infrastructure is only about conveying data packets, and then they are assembled, and the intelligence is really how they are structured when they come to the recipient at the edges of the network, or when are in servers that sit at the edges, at least in the original configuration of the internet. It was much more clear than what is today, but the fundamental thinking is that at the user is the place where the intelligence of the network sits in the application layer utilized by the user, whereas the infrastructure, the access layer, is only a let's say so-called dumb pipes, only pipes through which data can be conveyed. And this fundamental original thinking is what has sparked the net neutrality debate, meaning if the infrastructure is neutral to the content that we vehiculate, so to which kind of to any kind of content or any kind of application that we may want to share, and the way in which these are vehicle is not decided by the infrastructure, but by the applications we use and how the users decide to use those applications, then ISPs, operators, should not interfere in how data are vehiculated. That should be delegated to applications and to users, right? Now, next slide, please. If you want to have a better idea, I'm trying to simplify things because we don't have 6 hours, but we have a limited number of minutes during this conversation. But if you want to know more about net neutrality and various dimensions of this debate, I suggest you check these 2 books, both in free access at this URL that you see in the top, networkneutrality.info. Next slide. To make things super simple, when we speak about net neutrality, we can consider it a non-discrimination principle. So access providers, ISP, should not treat applications and content differently based on their commercial considerations. What does it mean? It means that if we assume that the intelligence is at the application layer, is the user is in power of his or her internet experience, we cannot allow ISPs to tell you will receive this kind of service with a better quality, or we will block this. Of course, unless this, as we were saying before, very rightfully, unless this is prescribed by law that is compatible with international human rights standards and so on. So unless that there is some technical reason for a discriminatory treatment or some legal justification for it, the rule should be that the transmission of data is non-discriminatory. Next slide, please. Now, what does this mean? It means that your network operator, your broadband provider, your mobile internet operator should not be considered as the editor of the internet. But if we come back to what we were saying before, this original thinking where operators and internet access providers are dumb pipes, it's only a conveyor, or a neutral conveyor of information, right? Next slide. Now, this is precisely what operators opposing net neutrality argued for. Next slide. And here I'm including a quotation from a memorandum filed by a very renowned US operator during a lawsuit against the Federal Communications Commission that culminated then in 2014 with the partial annulment of some parts of the Open Internet order at that time the FCC had had been adopted by the FCC. And in this submission by Verizon, in this court filing, they explicitly stated that just as a newspaper is entitled to decide which content to publish and where, broadband providers may feature some content over others. And so the fundamental thinking at that time of some operators, not every operator, but typically those with relevant market power and vertically integrated also with content provider. So their thinking was that if they wanted to give better quality to their commercial partners, or if they wanted to block specific applications, they could, because they were the owners of the pipes. Of course, this was conflicting with what this fundamental design of the internet and the fundamental philosophy of the internet that I was mentioning before, but also with several human rights framework that I'm going to mention in a couple of minutes. Next slide. Now, to have an idea of why then we reach the most recent evolutions in terms of internet access expansion, we first need to take a short trip through the first decade of net neutrality. Next slide. So, as I was mentioning, this is a cartoon made by Diplo Foundation. It really represents simplifying a lot, but in a very telling way, what was the problem with the unfair traffic management practices that starting from the mid-2000s, many operators started to implement because the technological advancements allowed them to implement them, and as there were no laws prohibiting to discriminate between different applications or content, they were just doing it, right? So the basic rationale was we have our infrastructure. If you really consider the infrastructure as pipes, then you have a certain limited capacity, and their basic reasoning was, well, we dedicate a portion of this capacity to those who are our commercial partners, so that they have always good quality, and those who are not our commercial partners because they do not pay us to have sufficient quality, or those who are our competitors, we do not give them the capacity they may need, right? Next slide. Now, of course, this resulted in some quite annoying practices. I'm not sure what is the age of the participants here, because sometimes with my students, when I speak about this, I'm speaking about Skype. I see faces of people lost in some very unknown items. Skype, for those who are slightly older, it's a well-known application. For the youngest generation, is something not really known. But those who are a little bit older will remind that in the early 2010s, Skype was blocked on a regular basis by the enormous majority of mobile providers because it was considered as a competing service that was allowing free calls, but there was no reason. There was no legal reason to block Skype. So to come back to the consideration that was raised before, if something is illegal, is illegal, and then the ISP has a duty to block this specific site or content, a very telling example is child pornography. If there is a website that is utilized to something clearly legal, like child pornography, the majority of ISPs will simply block it. But if you have a totally legal service like Skype, blocking it because it's a competitor, it's something totally not justified by any legal provision, only by the fact that you may lose your lucrative business of voice calls if other innovative apps emerged and are utilized by everyone, right? So that was the main reason why some operators were blocking Skype, because it was a competing service. Next slide. But of course, by throttling or blocking competitors, because it's something even more subtle of blocking an application, is throttling it, so downgrading the quality. Because if a service is blocked, you will blame the operator because it is not giving you access to Skype. But if the quality of Skype is downgraded, whereas the quality of another service is prioritized, the enormous majority of users will never think that is the operator that is downgrading one and prioritizing the other. Will simply think that the service doesn't work properly and will choose another one, right? So the kind of traffic management that at the time was implemented, it was very pernicious, because on the one hand was really reducing competition, on the other hand it was prohibiting the use of very totally legal services. And as we'll see next slide, the other consequence of this discriminatory blocking that I highlighted almost 10 years ago in this expert report for the Council of Europe is that it was also an undue restriction of freedom of expression. So if you have a fundamental right that is guaranteed under not only under international law, but under the majority of constitutions worldwide, to freely exchange and receive information with any legal service, then if Skype is a totally legal service, let's stick to this example, if someone is blocking you from using it, is an illegitimate interference in your freedom of expression, right? Before we go to the next slide, let me just check if everything is clear so far, because I'm introducing a lot of concept. So if there is any question, please feel free to interrupt me. Is there any question so far? Any remark?
Okay, let's check for you. Anybody have any questions on this content right now that's applicable to net neutrality and the legality and human rights issue? I'm just looking to see if anybody's typing, but there's no. Okay.
I do have a question, Glenn.
Go ahead, please.
This is Alfredo, Luca.
Hello, Alfredo.
So in terms of if there are two competing mobile operators and one includes among his or its services that he will allow extensive use of, for example, Skype, and it won't be counted against you in terms of the consumption of your data. Is that legal, or is that a state law or a country law, or how does that apply in the net neutrality environment?
Now, here's the thing. Thank you very much for this question. So here's the thing: if there is a legal provision that imposes to block specific services or specific content, as it was mentioned before, let's imagine child pornography, then an ISP has a duty to block those contents, right? But if the reason, one of the reasons why we released this report is that at that time in Europe, BEREC, that is the body of the European regulator of electronic communications, released a report precisely with statistics on how many users in Europe were victims of this kind of blocking or throttling practices, and without these practices being required by law. And there was a staggering 33% of all European users victim of these restrictions that were not mandated by law, but simply applied by operators in their terms of service. and in the practice, of course, implemented technically. Now, what is the problem here? First, that of course all the users of their service of those network operators could not use totally legitimate services. Let's come back to the example of Skype. If your operator prohibits you from using Skype, it means that you cannot freely communicate, right? But and then some observers were arguing, well, but then there is competition, and that was also the rationale of the European legislators at that time. With free competition, we solve this, because if you are blocked, you will choose another competitor. Well, not exactly, because if your operator blocks the use of a certain application, this affects all the users of that operator, but indirectly affects also all the users of other operator, because if the users of the other operator want to communicate with you through Skype, they cannot. So even if the competitors allow all services and do not apply restriction, the fact that only some market players restrict the way you can use internet indirectly affects all the other users, because there will be some applications, some services, that the fact that it may be a major operator is blocking them affects the use by everyone, right? Am I responding to your question, or is there any other follow-up on this?
Sorry, I keep muting myself, but okay. So we have a comment or a question from Ed.
Yeah, please.
And he's asking, can you speak about this principle? For example, Facebook launched their free, what they called the free internet basics.
Yes, free basics. Yes, I'm going to deal with this explicitly in a couple of slides. So bear with me. We are reaching this in 2 minutes. Now, next slide. Next slide. Now, the political regulatory movement of the early 2010s that led to the adoption of net neutrality rules and legislation in almost 50 countries that you see in light blue here in this map. This means that around 50 countries in the world explicitly regulated what kind of services can be blocked or throttled, for which reasons, and then provided that all the rest must not be unduly restricted, explicitly to protect, on the one hand, the full enjoyment of human rights, but on the other hand, also competition, innovation, because if we come back to my original consideration, users are prosumers. They can also produce innovation, application, content. The fact that they are not limited, unless there is a legal provision, means that they will produce innovation, they produce new content, new services, and this is extremely beneficial for the local innovation, for the local economy, and also for the global economy, right? Next slide. Now, here we reach the second chapter of the net neutrality saga, what I call the scramble for data. And here we understand why net neutrality is a quintessentially data protection issue, not only a content and freedom of expression issue. Next slide. So to understand the major shift that happens toward the mid of the 2010s, this forecast by Cisco in 2016 is extremely telling. So toward the mid of 2010s, all the operators and all the network equipment manufacturers and the majority of observers in the digital economy understand that there is going to be a major shift towards mobile internet. The traffic from wireless mobile device will account for 2/3 of the total IP traffic by 2020. That was the forecast of Cisco in 2016. This is a major shift, because if you remember the cartoon I showed before, that was essentially fixed internet, pipes, that connected people's home and on which operators had control and may manage through their traffic management. But here we have an incredible development towards mobile internet. And although on principle the net neutrality rationale applies exactly in the same way, the technology is completely different. Next slide. We have much more scarcity, if you want, and a different approach, because it is much easier to argue that as you are using a mobile device that has a mobile internet access has much higher limitations, data caps, monthly allowance of how much data you can use are much more reduced. And here is precisely the context where the zero rating debate finds a very fertile ground. Because if you argue that it's much more difficult to provide good quality mobile internet access, and then there are structural limitations to the kind of data allowance consumer may have, you basically start from a premise of scarcity. The data allowance you may have every month is limited. And here is where the genius of the zero rating models comes into the picture, because many operators, or even some dominant application providers, start to think, well, and if we overcome this limitation of this scarcity that exists by providing free gifts, free access to selected applications. And this is precisely what is zero rating about. A limited amount of data that you may enjoy every month, data to use for whatever you want, and then sponsored access to selected applications. Next slide. Now, these two elements are both essential, because we never have to forget that the two of them are the basics of zero rating. The fact that you have a limit in the amount of the open internet, or the internet that you can access as you want, and then the fact that you have unlimited access to selected sponsored services. Next slide. Now, this what also has to make us think about the fact that when you use a specific application, you are, as an internet user, you are accessing content. So data there is a data stream, a data flow bringing to you information, your Facebook timeline or your Twitter feed. But there is also another flow of data that are collected by personal data that are collected on your device and are sent to the servers of the service that is sponsored. So what is very important here to understand is that if we start from the assumption that there is a data cap of the open internet, whereas you have all you can eat of specific services, it means that the attention of the users, and we now know that data are the world's most valuable resource, and attention of the users correspond to capacity to collect data about them. So if you limit how they can choose and direct your attention towards what you give them for free, this is an incredibly interesting model to direct their attention to specific services, especially the attention of those millions, if not billions, of low-income individuals that will never have the money, the financial capability to purchase high data allowance per month, and we only stick in a very little data allowance, and then using the 2, 3, or 4 services that are zero rated, that are offered for free. Of course, those services are not offered for free, but they are paid with personal data, but that is something that we'll see in a couple of minutes. Next slide. Now, this phenomenon is something that I call the scramble for data, rephrasing what in the late 19th century came to be known as the scramble for Africa. Why? Because it's basically a new form of colonialism, where rather than having European countries scrambling for pieces of a continent, you have typically US, but nowadays also Chinese corporation scrambling for personal data. That is the new asset class that we know since 10 years is the most valuable asset class we have now. It's sufficient to check in the top 10 of the most valuable corporation in the world. You will see that all of them are data related in this moment. Now, this scramble for data is precisely what motivates these new economic models that even offer access to specific applications. Because offering access to sponsoring access to specific application is a very interesting move if you know that the return will not only be collecting all the data, but also be the only service that collects those data, because it's the only one that the user will utilize, because it's the only one free for the user, right? Next slide, please. Now, all this makes us understand that this, if we want to buy the rosy rhetoric of zero rating is a gift to low-income individuals that allow us to expand the internet access, that is the official PR rhetoric that was very popular when these schemes were introduced, well, we can buy it. But if we are a little bit more skeptical, we may think that actually putting a cap on the free internet and giving for free specific applications, it's an excellent strategy to steer the attention of individual users towards those specific services that then will collect your data. Next slide. Now, this is a very effective way of hooking individuals into subsidized apps. Now, let me clarify. I don't want to say that I'm not meaning that all possible types of zero rating are something that hooks individuals into subsidized apps. But the enormous majority of the models that we have seen so far are only sponsoring a very, very limited number of applications that then creates huge dependency because are the only one for free. And in many countries, they are the first ones that previously unconnected individuals starts to utilize, and then it's a sort of path dependency. If that is the first approach that previously unconnected individuals have with the internet, they think that those 2 or 3 applications are the internet, and we will see this in a couple of minutes. Next slide. To have a more concrete example of what I'm saying, what I'm arguing, some data from Brazil. In Brazil, 73% of the population uses prepaid offerings that are the cheapest, usually offerings that usually include zero rating plans. Typically, you have social networks, 2 or 3 social networks, and a couple of other partner application of the operator, and 95% almost of Brazilian, they use internet primarily for social networks, for messaging apps. Now, this may be a coincidence. Brazilians love only messaging apps, or maybe the proof that actually giving to 73% of the population only social networks for free then allows them to use and to get acquainted or even addicted to the use only of those 2 or 3 applications you give them for free, as they do not have the financial capability to access the rest. Next slide. This actually comes very, very useful into today's debate about Signal and WhatsApp. Now, as you might have heard some months ago, WhatsApp announced a update in their terms of service that basically will allow them to keep on harvesting a lot of data about you and formalizes this data, the sharing of those data with its parent company, Facebook. This stirred a lot of controversy, and a lot of users, actually those that are more concerned with their privacy and data protection, thought that it would be good to leave WhatsApp and choose Signal, an application that is exactly the same functionalities as WhatsApp, but does not collect any data. Well, this is possible even if you really care about your privacy. This is possible only if you can afford accessing this. Because think 1 second about it. If WhatsApp is for free, but Signal you have to pay for it because you have to use your data allowance and then pay money when you consume the data allowance, there are very few people in the world that will be able, especially in developing countries, to afford protecting their data and choosing a better quality application when they have another one that is for free. And that is a very important point and a very important consideration when we think about the fact that those applications that are sponsored, they are not sponsored for free. It's not a gift. They are paid with data rather than being paid with money, right? Next slide, please. Now this starts to let us understand what are the potential negative externalities of these zero rating models. So if you subject it's not only the choice by consumers, but also the possibility to share innovation that is not anymore permissionless. It's permissioned, is subject to the fact that an application has a zero rating agreement with a operator rather than the quality of the application. If privacy and data protection is a fundamental element of quality in a service, is an application. If you know that a service is free, but is because it is sharing your data with anyone willing to pay, well, you may be willing to choose another service that is free, but its business model is based on donations rather than share your data with everyone, right? Yes, right. But if the one that shares your data with everyone is the only free options that you have because it is zero rated, while the other one you have to pay for it, well, even if you care about the quality of the product and your fundamental rights, then you will have no choice. And it is a huge problem. Next slide. It is a huge problem because it's not only subjects the how innovation in a specific and the digital economy of a specific country may be shaped, but it also subjects how information or misinformation can circulate in a specific country. Imagine that also the only services that typically are zero rated are coincidentally also the greatest vector for fake news and misinformation. So rather than having consumers free to access whatever source of information they want because everything is freely accessible on the internet unless it is illegal, then you by putting a cap to what you can freely access while giving sponsoring only social network, 2 or 3 social network for free, then you also create a much easier environment for manipulation. Because on the one hand, there are only 2 or 3 corporations that massively collect data about anything you do of individuals, so there are only 2 or 3 channels for data collection. On the other hand, there are only 2 or 3 channels for disinformation. So if you want if you are a malevolent actor willing to target a specific country, let's say before the elections, with a massive disinformation campaign, you only need to orientate your campaign within 2 or 3 social networks rather than the entire internet, which would make, of course, things much more difficult. Next slide. This is precisely the kind of reasoning that orientated the decision of the European Court of Justice in September 2020. It basically agrees on every single point that I have just highlighted. Next slide. And although the European Court of Justice utilizes a more fundamental rights approach and specifically states that they call them non-zero tariff, it means zero-rated services and applications, are liable to limit the exercise of end-user rights. And the greater the number of customers concluding such agreements, the more likely it is that, given its scale, the cumulative effect of those agreements will result in a significant limitation of the exercise of end-users' rights. Why? This is the reasoning of the Court of Justice of the European Union. Because they perfectly understand that when you have dominant operators that have a lot of users providing only a few services for free, this has a direct impact on users' fundamental rights to freedom of expression, to privacy and to data protection, but also to enter a new business venture. So specifically in Europe, the right to create a business is a fundamental right. So the right to innovate, the right to contribute to the economy is hampered when your innovation will not be accessed based on the quality of your product, but based on the fact that someone else decides you deserve to be sponsored or not. Right? Next slide, please.
May I interrupt you?
Yeah, sure.
There is a question, and I think it's related to this because you dealt with the European Court. Lillian has asked, she says there's a narrative by the German Member of Parliament that the GDPR, the General Data Regulations protection, is now not enough to cover different apps' technical challenges. What is your opinion on that?
Well, that is also a topic for an entirely new lecture. But let's say that if GDPR was applied effectively, it could already be make a lot of difference. The problem that we have is that GDPR is, and this is a huge problem for Brazil, where there is a new law that is strongly inspired from GDPR, and but only now is going to be implemented by the newly created Data Protection Authority. The fact that you have a law does not mean that you have solved the problem, and I'm saying this as a lawyer that deeply mistrusts laws and how laws are created, because the letter of the law is usually very distant from the practice, right? So if you had if you take the case of Europe, where there is a highly complex and refined legal framework, GDPR, but I would say the majority of businesses and organizations do not comply with it. Not because they don't want to, because they don't know how to do it, or they simply ignore its existence. And this problem is enormously maximized in developing countries like Brazil that have just adopted a new data protection regulation, new data protection law that is wants to mirror what the highest standards of data protection, but in countries where there is zero data protection culture, people don't know how to deal with data protection. They don't even know what is the value of their data, and they are not used to comply with data protection laws. So not even the law is new and extremely complex, but regular people, regular businesses, regular organizations, regular public administrations, either they ignore its existence, or even if they know it exists, they don't know how to implement it. And even if they admit that it exists and they should implement, they frequently ask legal advice to lawyers that have only started to deal with data protection maybe a couple of years ago, because before it was not existing in the country. So the advice they receive is frequently not even good advice, even if you pay for it, right? So that is a huge problem, because the problem is not the fact that the law is not adequate. The problem is that the law is not duly implemented, or sometimes too difficult to implement, or sometimes it's really, even the approach is not correct, because it is not simply because you have a law that you will be able to regulate a phenomenon. You have to give also different kind of incentives. I don't know, fiscal incentive if you correctly comply with the law, tax cuts for those who implement it the best, or even create awards for the most innovative businesses or strategies to implement it. There is a very wide set of regulatory tools that may be used, rather than simply creating a law, creating a nice authority, and think that the magic is done. The law is the first step, but then you have to put it in practice, and that is the most difficult part. But now let's come back to zero rating, and now that I have let's say illustrated why this may be problematic, and the fact that it is extremely widespread, those practices, especially in developing countries, a question for you: who do you think might be the main beneficiary of zero-rated services globally? Next slide. Of course, this man, who is the owner and directly control the majority of shares of the Facebook group, and incidentally, Facebook, WhatsApp, and sometimes Instagram, or at least one of those three, are always zero-rated in 98% of countries where there is zero rating. Next slide. We actually mapped what countries have zero rating models and what services are zero rated in those countries. You see them here in different colors because we also included in what countries there is data protection law, because imagine if you live in a country where you have a lot of free apps, but you don't have any data protection law at all. It means that all those free apps are collecting your data, and then they could be used for whatever kind of manipulation or other purpose that you don't even have a right to be aware about, right? Next slide. Now, the majority, in many of those countries, as I was saying before, especially in developing countries, there was a nice reportage by Leo Mariani in 2016 about the fact that in many developing countries, when people, internet users, are interviewed, they think that Facebook is the internet. This is very interesting data. Why do they think that Facebook is the internet? Because it is the only app that they have for free. And so when they have to say what do they have access to, is Facebook. It's the only thing they have access to because it is sponsored, right? Next slide. So my great critique about zero rating is precisely that it can transform what have been conceived to be active internet users into passive consumers of predefined apps chosen by someone else, not by the user. Next slide. Now, the problem with all this is that users are not anymore the ones in power of their internet experience, and also that the applications that are frequently zero-rated are foreign applications harvesting data of your entire population. That is something that the Indian government has understood very well already in 2016 when it decided to ban zero rating to enforce strong net neutrality rules. And the outcomes of that decision are quite outstanding. Next slide. Over the 3 years that followed this ban of zero rating and enforcement of net neutrality regulations, the number of internet subscribers doubled, the average data consumption increased 50-fold, and the current price of the gigabyte is 1/20th of what it was 3 years ago. This because when the possibility to zero rate was prohibited, the only other option to win the market share was to offer everything for a cheap price rather than offering sponsored Facebook or sponsored WhatsApp to attract consumers, right? Next slide. Now, this is why you might have read over the past weeks, India is the country where Signal was the top-rated application for downloads. So when WhatsApp announced that it was going to change its terms of service to make data sharing with Facebook as the rule, in countries where you have a choice, people have decided to vote with their feet, leave WhatsApp, choose Signal, because they can. In other developing countries, you may really dislike the fact that your data are collected and shared with Facebook, but if you'd have to pay to use Signal, and you have not the financial capacity to use it, you will simply not do it, and you will stick with a poorer quality application because you don't have a choice. Next slide. Now here, what is important here is that the mega problem of all this is that zero rating offering are not free. They are paid with data and with anything that can be done out of data. And it is the reason why these models are pernicious, because they may have very nefarious consequences in terms of digital sovereignty, in terms of how national economies and national fundamental rights system will develop, because the internet experience of huge chunks of the population becomes only a couple of very easily manipulable applications. Next slide. And sorry, Glenn, how much time do I have still? 30 minutes, right? Or is?
Yeah, take as long as you want. I've already mentioned it in the chat for people who have to leave. They can listen to the recording. But I think you're on a stream of consciousness. I don't see really anybody dropping off. I think they're absolutely enthralled. So thank you so much for your time. So just carry on. And
yeah, perfect. But I promise I will be done in 10, maximum 15 minutes, so that then we can have a little bit of debate as well.
Thank you.
So is there any alternative strategy to really expand connectivity without having to oblige people to trade their access to specific apps with their privacy and their right to control their personal data? Next slide, please. Well, yes, we have some alternative, and actually some quite creative and non-conventional model, community networks. And now I would like to dedicate the next 10 minutes or 12 minutes to explore what are community networks and why they are so interesting as a strategy to expand connectivity. Next slide. So the first thing to understand is what are community networks? They are crowdsourced, distributed networks. Next slide. That are created, utilized, and managed by the local community, for the local community, as common goods, as commons. So imagine there are the neighbors that live in a certain neighborhood that all of a sudden realize that internet access is essential for them, and that they live in a so-called market failure area, so a rural area, a poor area where the market by definition fails to bring internet access. Well, they start to build it. Next slide. And there are some very interesting examples of also the governance models that spring out of this initiative, because they are, is the local community that starts to build the network infrastructure. They are quintessentially democratic governance system where a group of individuals, NGOs, local businesses, or public administration decide how to organize the network infrastructure rather than being simple consumers of someone else's service. They build their own service. Next slide. Now you can see here some of the most renowned examples. You have Gifinet, that is the largest community network in the world with 130,000 nodes, so almost 300,000 users. You have Altermundi in Argentina, which is a network of community networks. You have DEF, the Digital Empowerment Foundation in India, developing community networks since almost a decade. You have BARN, Broadband for the Rural North, which is an extremely interesting example, built by farmers in Lancashire, UK, who basically digged their trenches, laid fiber, and now have more than 10 gigabit per second as a speed limit to their broadband service, which, as they usually like to highlight, is more than what you may have at NASA. Next slide. A very interesting example is Zenzeleni, that has been first created by Carlos Aibueno and his colleagues in South Africa. It has also been featured in BBC News in this article that I have included here, precisely because it is a very interesting initiative where local people create their own network, their own infrastructure, and then use the internet to dramatically change their lives. How they can learn, how they can work, how they can trade, how they can heal themselves through telemedicine. Next slide. So the reason why I'm mentioning this strategy and I'm comparing it with the previous example of Z-rating is because it is dramatically different. It is actually the opposite. So by allowing people to create their own network, you basically unleash a virtuous circle of knowledge and innovation. Next slide. The network actually becomes an engine to trigger positive externalities. People can freely communicate, they have access to knowledge. Innovation becomes permissionless again, because anyone can innovate as they want, and the internet becomes much more interesting because when you have services and applications tailored for the local community, perhaps in local language, this becomes much more interesting for the local community. They are not mere consumers or Facebook. They become those who develop their own platform to trade locally, to share news locally, maybe in the local language that is not even considered by major platforms. Next slide. So some trivial example of what are the services that are usually developed by members of these community networks are local maps, instant messaging applications, voice over IP to maybe contact their relatives that migrated abroad, hosting services, local e-commerce platform, e-health applications. There was an application developed by some community network members in Nepal that recently won an award by the World Health Organization because they created an application for local women to have information about pregnancy. Imagine if you live in Nepal, information about health is not really handy. If you have internet access, it becomes much easier. And if you have specific needs and you know how to develop your connectivity and how to use the internet, and that you can produce things and you receive some basic training on how to do this, then you are born by default as a prosumer, which is completely different from the experience on those who have as a first contact with the internet only a couple of apps of which they are passive users. Next slide. So the local community, by creating community network, self-determine itself. This is the quintessence of self-determination. Next slide. And it is precisely by the in the work that I have been conducting, research I have been conducting. Next slide. Over the past year, I called this emergence of a new principle of network self-determination, which is the right to free development of free infrastructure. We see in the evidence provided by this example that they basically implement through concrete initiative what already exists and is considered as fundamental rights in the International Fundamental Rights Framework. Next slide. So what I call network self-determination is basically the right to freely associate, freedom of association, in a democratic fashion, self-determination, to design, develop and manage network infrastructure as a common good in order to freely seek, impart and receive information and innovation. This last part is just a rephrasing of freedom of information, freedom of expression. Next slide. So what do these community network initiative allow is not only expansion of connectivity, having the individuals at the center, but also a new ways of enjoying fundamental rights through creativity, through innovation, and by creating new services, new content that positively contribute also to the local economy, primarily to the local economy, to the national economy. Next slide. Now, to conclude, what can we do to facilitate these initiatives? Next slide. And this is something we have sketched in various reports that I've mentioned, but some very key points are legally defined what they are, because in many countries they are not
alert from calendar
yet
Dr. Elena Jimenez
legally, simplifying licensing authorization so that anyone can have access to license to be an ISP and an operator, simplify equipment approval, because sometimes in many countries you cannot do it yourself. You cannot use any kind of material you want. You can also only use those that are explicitly approved by the regulator, even if it is for a very local and limited network. Also, in many countries, and this is something that is very much debated lately, is rejuvenate and rethink, simplifying and making it a little bit smarter the way spectrum is allocated and how spectrum sharing is possible, and of course tax exemptions and funding for this kind of initiatives, knowing that they positively contribute to local economy. Next slide, please. All the information that I've mentioned, you may find it again in these two reports that I've already mentioned and that are freely accessible. Next slide, please. And these are two examples of how these notions have been concretely put into practice by two regulators of Latin America. Anatel in Brazil has adopted 2 years ago a license waiver for small multimedia communications providers. So if you have less than 5% of market share, which is already a lot in each state that composes the Brazilian Federation, you have the right to have a waiver to the license to be an operator, and it is extremely positive for small micro operators such as community networks. And another very positive example of a good practice is Argentina, where ENACOM has adopted a regulation specifically to provide juridical certainty on community networks. Next slide. And also another very good practice that I think is worth mentioning is that the Brazilian regulator, in his online resources about community networks that has recently created, explicitly includes one of these books that I have mentioned, that I had the pleasure to organize and to edit and to partly write with an excellent team of colleagues and friends from the Internet Governance Forum Coalition on Community Connectivity. Now, this has been used as the source to provide guidance on how to build community networks by the Brazilian regulator. So it's a very good example of how all these nice reports and material that are produced in these nice fora where people gather around the world, well, how this can concretely impact national policy making and the lives of people, and how connectivity evolves in specific countries. Next slide. To conclude, I would like to stress that I don't want to argue that community networks are the silver bullet that is going to change everything, but I think it's very important to consider that there is nothing to lose if you allow people to build the internet themselves and to construct, to build, to manage these initiatives. And therefore, I think it is absolutely in the common interest to incentivize them and at least not to create obstacles to them. Next slide. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you want to share any critique, comments, or if you have any question, please feel free to drop me an email at the address that you see here, or exchange views and comments on Twitter. I also added my Twitter handle there so that we can also keep in touch. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. It's very enlightening, and I think everybody has enjoyed it. Unfortunately, Alfredo had to run to another meeting, but it was just me. But I'd like to thank you for your generosity today to join us today and walk us through this very complicated issue. And it's great to circle around on the issue is that, community can take charge. They just don't have to be passive consumers. That they, as human beings, we have a right to give and take information. So I'd like to thank you again for all your time today, and I'd like to thank everybody that joined us. And they were a little longer than the normal session of 1 hour, and I appreciate you all staying. And the recording will be available as usual. And again, that's about it. So I don't see any other questions. Any final comments, Luca?
I just wanted to thank you again for the kind invitation. I really appreciate being with you today, and I apologize if I was a little bit late. And yes, of course, the content was quite dense. And if any one of the students wants to digest it and then come back to me with some comments or questions, you have my details, and I will be very happy to provide replies or to have a conversation in the forthcoming future.
Great, thank you again. And all the best. That concludes the session today, and we'll see you all next week with Damien Ashcroft. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Bye.